Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 106th episode. Our guest today is Aurobindo Ghosh, Assistant Professor of Finance at the Chian School of Business, Singapore Management University. Professor Ghosh is deeply involved in financial literacy, running a program for young adults. He's also the founding principal investigator of the quarterly DBS SKBI Syndex project. We'll talk about that in greater detail in the podcast. Over the past decade, Professor Ghosh has worked diligently on building surveys and models of inflation expectations in Singapore and remains hard at work in refining measures of cost of living. Work is very timely given the spurt in cost of living we have seen in past few years worldwide, not just in Singapore. One additional point, Professor Ghosh, along with Amit Haldar and Kalyan Bhaumik, are the editors of a book that was published last year. It is a collection of multidisciplinary essays titled Managing Complexity and COVID-19, Life, Liberty, or the Pursuit of Happiness. Remember those trade-offs we have to deal with? This book is all about that, and I recommend it highly, not least because I had the honor of contributing a chapter in it as well. On that note, Aurobindo Ghosh, welcome to Kopi Time.
Thank you so much, Taimur, for having me.
It's great to have you here. Aurobindo, I want to devote a large chunk of our discussion on your research on cost of living. And I have been in DBS for 6 years. When I first joined, you reached out to me, and that led to this partnership between my bank DBS and your institute, Sim Ki Boon, at SMU. And jointly, we have been doing this quarterly study of inflation expectations. So give us some background. So what was the motivation? What made you go ahead with this? And give us a sense of how you go about doing this survey.
Sure. I mean, thanks for having me once again in your, may I say, celebrated and insightful podcast. Going well past a century of episodes. It's a hard thing to capture imagination for a while, but if you have done it for over a century episodes, that's amazing. So an opportunity that, of course, you embarked on to connect experts to audience and presented in a crisis of its own during the pandemic, as you rightly mentioned about the book, which was also kind of induced by the pandemic lockdown, if I may say so. So in some sense, sometimes opportunities that comes in the form of crisis. And that's exactly what happened for the genesis of the Singapore Index of Inflation Expectations, which we are very happy to have DBS supporting over the last, 5 years or so since you joined DBS as well. So indeed, one of the things that happened goes back in time to the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, when inflation rates started climbing up early in 2010s to over 5% globally. So Singapore economy could have been very adversely affected at that time, as there was no real market-driven measures of inflation expectations like the Treasury Inflation Protected Security, which is available in the US. And there was, of course, a risk of unhinged inflation expectations, which might have been detrimental to the effectiveness of monetary policy in any economy, and particularly for a small open economy like Singapore, which imports most of its consumables and follows an exchange rate-based monetary policy as opposed to an interest rate-based monetary policy. So the main concern that was highlighted by policymakers back in the U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, as well as St. Louis Federal Reserve President James Bullard, on the possibility of unanchored or unhinged inflation expectations relative to the forward guidance provided by the central banks. So Syndex survey started not to second guess the inflation rate itself that was measured by agencies in Singapore, but to measure the impact of anchoring of inflation expectations. So is that forward guidance landing in the right place? Are people believing that based on their own experiences? So we conduct the online survey. It's interviews, which is through a well-researched questionnaire developed over the last 10 years or so. A random sample of 400 to 500 consumers in Singapore who roughly represent the demographic distribution of age and gender. The Syndex survey originated back in 2011, as I mentioned, in September, from a collaboration at that time with MasterCard and the Sim Ki Boon Institute of Financial Economics to address essentially the problem of how do you measure inflation expectations to begin with.
So how many rounds of the survey have we done so far?
So we have completed 48 quarterly rounds of the survey. So that's really 12 years of the survey. That in that sense, it's probably one of the longest survey that is not funded through the central bank. So in a way, a privately run survey, which is of course followed by the central bank for this long. So 48 is an amazing series of data. We are waiting for, of course, more and more information to come in as well. But the what we have so far is a treasure trove of data as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Give us a sense of your key impressions from this totality of the work. And also give us a sense of your view. I mean, how useful have these been, and who are the primary consumers of the insights that these surveys generate?
So let's go back to this idea of inflation expectations for a second. So inflation expectation can easily be a self-fulfilling prophecy, at least in the downside. So if there is some trigger or some reasons to believe that inflation will actually go up, then individuals will make actually decisions to buy big ticket items right away, which of course becomes something like a self-fulfilling prophecy, with prices in the short run going up. And similarly, if they expect prices to come down, and that might also happen to some extent. So what we did at the beginning of the study is to survey individuals rather than households, and this is an online survey because the turnaround time is much sooner. And we had, over the last 12 years, we have seen several different incidents. I mean, it's important to mention that it was not just a flat process of getting the data, but what we saw in that particular period is, of course, a zero lower bound existing for a while, and then we also saw an even negative interest rate in the Eurozone and Japan, taper tantrums back in 2013, where Fed declaring a rate cut, cut back on the bond buying back for quantitative easing, if you remember that. And then, of course, besides that, you had seen a slump and a revival of oil prices, and 100-year-old, once in a 100-year pandemic that of course kind of disrupted life across the board. So all of these things means that we have significant variations of inflation expectations. Now, our impression, going back to your question, was that the DBS SKBI CPIX, which is what we call the headline inflation expectation, has been fairly stable. It has been fluctuating, but it has been fairly stable, and it is kind of finding its position, similar to what a longer term, more, I would say, average value of inflation expectation would be, without severe fluctuations along the way. And it seems to be somewhat straddling between the outcome that we see of the current inflation rate and what the experts, in this case the survey of professional forecasters, have been forecasting over quarterly as well. But one of the key impressions that we found out is, like, it does suffer from certain issues like behavioral biases that we will talk about later as well. But more importantly, it is identifying the change points quite accurately, particularly when the market is seeing sort of a peak of inflation, so to say, going forward. We are finding that that's quite accurate as well going forward, and looking at the data that is coming out later. And also, in some sense, the level hasn't been, because it's quarterly, so in a sense medium term, it is not short term or monthly, so we don't see that much of fluctuation in the inflation expectations as well. It has been to some extent predictive. I will give some examples as well of how inflation rate panned out in the next period. But at the same time, what it has done is it has actually been used as part of a dashboard that the central bank also uses to come up with their sort of prediction or policy mechanism as well in Singapore. So there has been some differences from what we see out there and how the central bank might have changed their policy to some extent. But it's very hard to identify that every time this inflation expectation goes up, that will actually have a reaction in central bank policy as well. So I think it has been fairly persistent in that sense, as is expected of inflation expectations, but it has not suffered from undue fluctuations that would suggest that inflation has been unanchored for a while as well.
So just to expand on your point you made earlier, that it is not that useful to sort of take the exact point estimate of the survey expectation. So maybe people might say, I expect prices to go up by 10%. To
Right.
you, more interesting is, are they saying that in relationship to the fact that they used to say my inflation expectation is 8, meaning it's gone up. Or if they're saying 10 and they're saying going forward, my expectation is 7. So that directionality is far more informative than the actual number, which can be subject to all sorts of biases. And I think that is an important takeaway from the work that you do. So let's stay with that point, and let's go to the more results of the recent years of the survey. So how have inflation expectations in Singapore evolved in the past few years, and what is the latest survey saying?
So of course, in the past few years, we have seen fluctuations on both sides. So during the pandemic period, inflation really slumped. Inflation expectations also slumped together with it. And then it kind of picked up, what we are seeing that right around after the vaccine was essentially discovered and deployed, inflation expectations, particularly in certain sectors like housing and other commodities, started going up and picking up as well in Singapore. Being a small open economy, which is affected by and imports most of its stuff from elsewhere, there has been some impacts that we see that is reflected. So a couple of them I will mention. So one is, of course, increase in oil prices. That has an impact, and you see certain increase in the inflation expectations in the post-pandemic period as well. And then we see certain pass-through costs, which are also related indirectly, where there was restrictions on movement of people. So there was certain impact on the wage rates that are pass-throughs that goes into the prices, as well as accommodation cost, which has also kind of gone up as well. So overall, in the recent period, we found out that inflation expectations, what Singaporeans believe, has gone up, but the rate of increase has softened or kind of mitigated of late. So it is not going up as fast as initially about a year back, but it is now kind of tempered. It's not going down yet, at least from the current survey, but the rate of increase, which is sort of the slope, has sort of dampened to some extent.
Great. Okay, so now you talked a little bit about professional analysts and inflation expectations. So let's get into that. Singapore is full of banks, financial institutions, academics. So there are lots of professional forecasters out there who follow price developments in Singapore and make forecasts, not to mention the government agencies do the same. And now you have about 12 years worth of data surveying day-to-day Singaporeans and getting their inflation expectations. What is the relationship between these two?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the reason it's a very good question is that your expectation, before any data that you look at, would be that typically your consumers, on so-called the lay person on the street who are making economic decisions, will be following the expert's opinion about where inflation is going to head to. But we tend to see something slightly different. We find out that, while the professional economists, in this case, private sector economists, are probably more informed because they are closely linked with the bank policies, both the central bank as they are, what they see in the data as well. So they are sort of more in line with what the expectations of the central bank would be. And you would expect the consumers will be less informed of that, and they would have sort of their own independent movement, maybe tracking what the professional economists do. Now, since the survey that we run is actually run about a week after the survey of professional forecasters are released, we expected that particular linkage. That means that the individual respondents are going to follow the experts. But we see a sort of different cycle. It seems like that actually the experts are following the individual respondents. So, which is kind of strange, because and I'll give you the reasons for it. So back in 2012, so it started in 2011. Back in 2012, we looked at the quarterly data on the last quarter of 2011, 1 year ahead. So that was around 4.6%. That is, as I mentioned, the genesis was because there was a spike in inflation rate at that time. Global was around 5%. So we saw that it was about 4.6% 1 year ahead. And it turned out, strangely enough, that's the only time it has happened. 1 year later, from the actual data, the inflation rate, quarterly inflation rate, actually the yearly inflation rate of 2012 was 4.6%. It was exact. But the professional forecasters actually surveyed at 3.1%. So which seems like that, somehow the expectations that consumers had was better anchored and the final outcome 1 year later than the experts. And since then, it seems like it was a little bit of catch up for the experts to catch up to what the consumers are saying. So in some sense, even though we timed it to be really, the data is collected after the professional survey is announced, but it seems like most of the time it goes the other way around, and the forecasters, in this case the survey forecasters, tend to follow in some cases what the consumers are thinking. But obviously, of late, when you have several rounds of monetary tightening, in this case, increase of the slope of the Singapore dollar exchange rate based policy, you saw that there is a sort of decline in expectations of professional forecasters quite significantly. This is in line with what is going on in the US, as we have seen even recent data that was released a couple of days back, that New York survey is saying that the numbers are coming down to closer to 3%, going for the longer term forward guidance of 2%. But besides those sort of main anchors, we find that individual respondents seems to be fairly stable, but professional forecasters seems to be moving closer to them rather than the other way around, that individual respondents are going towards professional forecasters' announcements.
Aurobindo, okay, at sometimes professional analysts may do better than the average public, and sometimes, as you said, the average public's expectations seem to be leading them. Putting that aside, just the nature of inflation expectation, is it largely adaptive? And to those of our audience who don't know the meaning of that word in the context of economics, is it really that my expectations are basically based on what has been going on the last 12 months?
Well, the challenge is the way some of the data is collected. We have to be cognizant of that. So a lot of data that we collect is from consumers' information. Many of their information is based on their own past experience. So despite of the fact that we try to sort of, I would, or lack of a better term, educate them about the current data, they might still follow their own instincts more than what policymakers are saying, or the forward guidance which I mentioned is given. So in a way, I think there is some levels of adaptiveness if there are significant impact. Like, for example, with a tightening of monetary policy, there was expectation the prices are not going to be unhinged because the Singapore Central Bank, in this case the Monetary Authority, will take enough measures to try to curb this exchange rate based policy so that the prices don't go ahead and become unhinged to some extent. So indeed, that part, I think, sometimes is reflected, that people do react to those information. Particularly, we see in announcement of macroprudential measures like policies on real estate prices. So there is significant decline in their expectations about whether prices are going to go up or not based on the policies that are announced. But the reaction for inflation expectations is not as responsive. Maybe part of the reason is the frequency of the announcement that comes from the central bank as well. There is only semi-annual policy statements that are made, and so there might not be enough anchors that are out there for individual respondents to react to that. So I think they are basing it mostly on their own experience more than what the policy announcements are.
Which is fair. I mean, I would not expect the average person to spend too much time thinking about monetary policy directionality. But to your point earlier, that the long-term inflation expectations certainly are a function of both expectation that the central bank is serious about dealing with it, and which may or may not reflect past performances, but in a way, implicitly, it does. MAS, monetary policy, do you see it being substantially cognizant of inflation expectations, or is it also looking at sort of past developments and professional forecasts and trying to do the best out of that?
Yeah, so I think in the current state of of course, as I mentioned, the monetary policy, which is based on exchange rate, as well as looking at trade-weighted basket of currencies for the SNER, which is essentially the Singapore dollar nominal effective exchange rate. Now, when you are looking at a policy which is exchange rate based, there is no other alternative options of looking at what the true value, the signal of the inflation expectations from the market, then they have to base it on survey-based measures. So the two survey-based measures they are looking at is, of course, the survey of professional forecasters, but as I mentioned, that might be very closely linked to the signals coming from MAS directly. So they might be looking at their own policy impact in the professional forecasters announcement, but this particular survey, which is the Syndex, DBS SKBI Syndex survey, gives a fresh piece of evidence. So that might be tempering some parts of their policy. Like, for example, if they think tightening could wait for a little while longer, that there are, so more or less not that much fluctuation in inflation expectations, they might be able to decide on that based on the numbers from the inflation expectations that we see from the survey as well. So given there is no market-based measures as such, I think these are the main sources of signals that the monetary authority actually is getting to make their judgment and decisions as well.
Is there a distinction between analyzing inflation expectations, which is what we've been talking about, and analyzing cost of living, something that I think you have been working on quite a bit lately?
Yes, absolutely. And this is sort of one of the challenges that is not uniquely Singapore, but because most of the data on cost of living, as well as inflation, is collected from urban centers. And Singapore, of course, is an urban center as well as a city state. The two together means that the impact of changes of inflation will have an impact on cost of living. But what we found out in the research that we did together with a couple of my ex-students and currently colleagues at IMF as well, Ms. Kathy Chauhan, on this particular aspect of what exactly is cost of living in some sense, and how is it related to inflation and inflation expectations. We found out something quite interesting, that if we try to replicate a more, I would say, a well-known cost of living index, which is from the Economic Intelligence Unit World Cost of Living Index, or WCOL, which is the purpose of that is to see how professionals can be moved, executives can be moved from different cities of the world, around 140 odd cities that are covered, and see whether what will be the impact on that particular move. So they look at cost of living from that particular perspective. So they look at around over 100 different sample prices of different standard baskets that they have looked at across the world, and they use that to measure that which city might be kind of declared the most expensive city to live in. But typically it's for most expensive city for expats to move in. So that's sort of their main purpose. So what we did was we used that data, and then we recreated something similar to the consumer price index, kind of closely tracking it. And we found something quite fascinating, is that even when inflation was near zero or negative, as I mentioned during the pandemic times, a little before as well, inflation actually went a little negative as well, the quarterly inflation. We found out that the cost of living actually was going up, even in that scenario. And this is quite unique and peculiar, if you can think of it, that mostly the origin of inflation was to measure cost of living. But for comparability, if you think of comparing apples with apples, they have to fix a basket so that we can compare two different points of time. That's what CPI is. Compared to the base period, how much is a particular basket of goods and services, how expensive or how dear would it be at that particular point. So they're keeping the basket same and finding the price differential between them. But there's another way of looking at it. It's looking at the standard of living same and find out how much more you're going to spend under certain budget constraints. So the second one is the cost of living measure. The first one is more the inflation measure. So standard of living being same, how much more you spend becomes actually a measure, a de facto measure of cost of living. So we looked at that, and we found out that indeed, that even when there is a flat inflation rate with a fixed basket, people are adaptively choosing a basket that might cost more, which means that to keep maybe the standard of living about the same, or maybe there is some aspirational impact as well. So people want a better standard of living, and that is possibly what is causing the cost of living to increase even when inflation is flat. Now, that differential is something that actually central banks and policymakers should be aware of, that even when inflation is flat, it might seem like cost of living is actually going up. So part of it is probably aspirational, but part of it is generated from the inflation and the similar basket that we talked about before. Now, what exactly can we infer from that? That in a city state where everything is being imported, there is the transmission can happen through cost of living, through pass-through cost, as well as this aspirational cost when you see people around you having sort of a better standard of living as well. So there are these endogenous choices which might actually make this cost of living impact. I would say far worse than what you see just the inflation impact. So if inflation technically is something like 3% or 4%, your cost of living increase might be about 7-8%.
Right. Aurobindo, I have a couple of thoughts on this issue. So, for example, in the context of the US, we see cost of living across states vary substantially. So you could argue that in the US over the last 1 year, inflation has come down substantially, but still people from California are moving to Texas because of tax differential, home price differential. And so then the level is also an important consideration on a relative scale that, is my neighboring country or neighboring state offering me a lower cost for all those basket of goods that I consume, assuming, of course, my income remains same. If taxes were to play another role, then of course the net of income tax becomes an important consideration as well. So that's one thing. I mean, I feel that, sitting here in Singapore, we always talk about Hong Kong. That the cost of living in Hong Kong traditionally has been much higher than Singapore. It seems like the tables have turned and the cost of living there is actually lower than Singapore. The second one is this level versus difference issue that you also alluded to, that you could have times when inflation, the rate of inflation is low or coming down, but that doesn't mean that the level of prices have come down. You need deflation for the level to come down. It's like Singapore's property prices. It may be flat on a year-on-year basis, but it is up like 25% over the last 2 years. So when you start thinking about the cost of living, not of expats, not of people who are looking Singapore versus Hong Kong, but looking at just living in Singapore, day-to-day basis. And where we know that, wage growth is moderate. We don't have sort of the situation we have in some other countries where wage growth is very strong. So then do you get the feeling, looking at your surveys and looking at your analysis of cost of living, that Singaporeans' affordability is actually getting pushed back, that it's not expanding?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a pretty deep problem in multiple fronts. So I'll explain the difference between Hong Kong and Singapore. And as you rightly mentioned, that maybe if you look at the cost of living element of it, there is a challenge on how house prices, accommodation plays a very important role in the cost of living as well, is actually seeping into the cost of living framework. And that's one of the things that is causing the cost of living to go up. But there is another aspect to it. I mean, you can endogenously choose some certain baskets that will fit your standard of living. So you might be able to sort of do some kind of a trade-off between two baskets. But having said that, I think there is another channel that we are sort of ignoring, which is the wage rate and the price relationship. So when you have wages go up, for a variety of reasons, could be policy reasons as well. So when wages go up, there will be some impact on the prices as well. So the question is that, is wage going up relative to the prices or not? That might also influence how movement can occur from one country to another. I mean, you are also looking at prospects of what is the possibility of the growth. So if there is significant movement of, say, talent coming from one part to another, you would see there will be an impact on housing prices as well. And that house price, together with the higher wages, might have an adverse impact. So you have to have policy which is sort of adaptive to such changes as well. So it's kind of very difficult to, I would say, isolate different standards of living because there will be these sort of feedback loops between them, but at least be cognizant of that. And that might help to kind of lower prices, which is, so having stickiness in I would say accommodation costs in some cases might also be contributory factor to this increase in cost of living, because the rental has to be often passed through to prices. So the question now is that compared to Hong Kong, are rentals in, say, Singapore increasing at a lower rate or increasing at the same rate. I mean, as you mentioned already, and correctly so, that when the level is higher and it doesn't seem like prices are going down, so a lot of properties are held, in this case, say commercial properties are held, which is in shopping malls, which are sort of shut down or closed, rather than lowering the price. We know that if there's excess supply, the prices should follow suit. But rather than that, if there are portions which are not available in the market, hoping for the market to recover, that impact will actually go back to the prices as well.
Absolutely. So, Aurobindo, we are fully cognizant that, and yes, like any other part of the world, there are parts of Singapore where rents are high, and there are parts of Singapore where rents are not very high.
That's
and
correct.
The places where rents are high, the expats are competing against each other to rent these places. Places where rents are not very high, largely local population is living. But that's the rental argument. Do you have any insights from your studies to tell us beyond rent if there's heterogeneity of prices in Singapore? I mean, if I go to a grocery store, is it the same in the northern part of Singapore versus the eastern part of Singapore and western part of Singapore?
This is a fascinating thing because Singapore is such a small place. You expect that prices will adaptively change.
Fully arbitrage away, yeah.
Yeah, so it will not exist because all you have to do is like 10 minutes drive away or 10 minutes bus ride or train ride away. You would be able to buy at a cheaper rate. And particularly with the pandemic, you would expect there will be a more equalization, if I may say so, of prices. But it turns out that is not entirely true. So indeed, we probably are sort of slaves of habit to some extent, that we tend to shop in the same place rather than shop around, which I think would be a better thing to do to figure out what is the best price, whether we can actually order online. Now, ordering online also have a cost implication, right? So if the transport cost goes up or the quantity that is being delivered have certain features in it, you might indirectly, because of the bundling, might be exposed to a higher cost rather than buying something at the point that you need it. So all of these things put together, it turns out that indeed that you would be able to get a lower price in certain parts of Singapore compared to other, probably because of the discounts that you get. So the stated prices might be the same. So when you look at just the quoted price from online platforms might be the same, but at the same time, you might be able to shop around and see there are better discounts that are available. So we don't have the data on the transacted price. So if you have the data on the transacted price rather the quoted price, then we might have a better sense of how much different parts of Singapore are. Obviously, property prices are very different across different prices parts of Singapore. Rental is different. So you can expect that pass-through will also be different in different parts of Singapore as well.
Right. So we've largely talked about data, observations from the data so far. I want to talk a little bit about policy.
Sure.
What, in your view, is the best way of dealing with cost of living increases in an open economy like Singapore? And I underscore the point, it is not just a Singapore-specific problem. I mean, I just came back from the UK, where utility bills are up 3 times from they were before the war in Ukraine. The high cost of gas and electricity have added to significant amount of concerns around cost of living. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. But we're living in Singapore. We want to know about Singapore. What, in your view, is the best way to deal with the cost of living here?
So let me mention about Singapore. As you mentioned, UK might be facing other challenges from because of Brexit and other things as well.
Right.
But in Singapore, our main challenge is being a small open economy. We actually have a double whammy every time there is an increase in, say, oil prices or commodity prices. So the oil price increase together with maybe a speculative increase of US dollar rate creates a double whammy. First of all, you have to pay more for oil, which has sort of an impact across the board. And then, of course, you have to pay up in US dollar, which might become also more expensive compared to Singapore dollar. So I think the main challenge for policymakers in Singapore is that they have to really do catch up on the tightening of the monetary policy. I think from my vantage point on looking at the data, and given how the exchange rate policy in Singapore works, I think we would probably have a better communication of what the policy stance of the government is, in a more, I would say, digestible way, might be better for people to understand that whether to spend now or later. And that part, like, for example, are there supply restrictions on certain elements that we would have a higher price on something? So they expect how to manage their future cost implication. And that might be one of the ways that you put the problem back to consumers to decide exactly what to buy and when, at least from that particular point of view. And then the other thing, of course, as I mentioned, is that maybe some levels of you know relaxation on the other aspect of increase in costs, which is a tighter labor market, might also be meaningful, because a lot of Singaporeans eat out. And because of that, the impact of a tight labor market having impacted on F&B sector is also passing through their costs. So that is sort of one of the things that they cannot really, adjust it as much. And finally, I would say that, I wouldn't say deregulation per se, but a more competitive rental market for commercial property is probably a better option going forward, because that also, so I'm looking at pass through being one of the things that, at least to some extent, the policies can address. It's not really a monetary policy per se, because to some extent monetary policy cannot help in pass throughs. It has to be done in Singapore dollar, right? It's not paid in US dollar, in any other currency. So somehow policy will have zero impact. Monetary policy, exchange rate policy will have zero, if not maybe a very little impact on these pass-through costs. So addressing the pass-through costs and communications are, I think, the two best way of at least going through this current phase of possible spike, or short-term spike in prices.
Well, Aurobindo, we are recording this on the afternoon on the 15th of August, and let me read you the latest headline from the Straits Times Online. Housekeepers, porters added to list of jobs open to work permit holders from more locations. So to your point of, liberalizing the labor market, the services side, the authorities have heard you, and they're trying to take some measures in that direction. No, I fully agree with you. But a couple of interesting policy dilemma come in.
Yeah.
We want a greener city. We want a city that is not congested with cars, and therefore Singapore has a rather unique solution for the world in terms of certificate of eligibility for cars. People compete to get the right to have their cars on the roads of Singapore, and price of that has skyrocketed. But you could also argue it should skyrocket because we want less people to own cars in a country where there is first-class transportation infrastructure, and tens of billions of dollars are being spent to actually enhance that transportation infrastructure. So that substitutability, that should I drive a car versus should I take the MRT, sometimes I guess when there is a lot of desire and aspiration to drive the car, we will say cost of living is high. But if people choose to drive MRT, we'll say cost of living is low. How do you square that?
Yeah, that's exactly the point, right? So this inherent aspirational aspect of it has an impact that goes directly to our pocketbook. But then again, I mean, you shouldn't say that you should not drive a car, because if car is your access to a particular social circle, then that might be causing it. But there is another aspect to it as well. The certificate of entitlement going up, because of possibly limited supply, as well as a much higher demand from people moving into Singapore, might have other unintended consequences. So I will give one example first. You might be able to sort of justify through the more sustainability moves as well that you don't want as many cars in Singapore. But then again, commercial cars, ones which are carrying goods and services around, also have a higher cost to pay for the certificates. If you look at the shared car sharing and other drivers which are Grab and other facilities that are available, one of the challenges for that is that they might also be the one who are bidding for the COE. Right. So which means that you are automatically increasing. So because maybe more people are going into the gig workspace and they are using that, well, let's buy a car and then use it to earn sort of a secondary income, that might also be having an impact. So I think maybe ones which are ride-sharing cars might be put in a slightly different category than COEs, because or different form. I mean, I'm not going to go ahead and create more COEs for that matter, but I think they should be cognizant of that as well, because this might be causing this change. So there is one is earning a living which should be encouraged. But the other one is possibly more conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption can be taxed more, but earning a living, it is taxed more. Then that has other impacts on the society as well.
Fair enough. For the longest time, I have felt that there should be a regulation related to the number of cars a household can have, or the number of cars the household can have under a certain COE regime. So the first car at a reasonable rate, and the second and the third car progressively more steep. But I also realize that these things are easy for me to say, sitting in the armchair. It's not that easy to implement. What is a nuclear family, and how many cars should the nuclear family need? Can the authorities decide on that on behalf of families or not? Maybe not that straightforward, although it seems to me that might be a reasonable solution. Let me come back to this study. As you have pointed out earlier, that this has been going on for more than a decade. You have 4 rounds of survey. Have you modified the study, and do you have plans to refine it further?
Yes, we have. So in 2018, we actually did a study to figure out, effectively how can we make these respondents, who are basically consumers, a cross section of Singapore population, to make them more professional, so they have more information, more data that they can use to make better judgments about what to expect in future. So indeed, we did a randomized control trial to figure out, how we can do that. So this was back in 2018 in a collaboration with the Monetary Authority of Singapore and the Behavioral Insights team, which is essentially part of the British Cabinet Office, which incidentally had, among other people, Richard Thaler, who is a Nobel laureate for his work on behavioral finance. We use this behavioral insights into developing the questionnaire. So that's one part, how our questionnaire has developed and adjust these biases that can be there when we are asking questions to consumers who are possibly not primed in a particular way. So that is one part. And of course, we have a quarterly survey, as you mentioned, which has 4 quarters, but we have other data as well that we collect. We haven't really completely released all the data as well, because we need a certain amount of the data to make it more predictive, to address the time series fluctuations and nature of the differences of regimes as well that can entail. So all these data are available. So we are looking at things like implications, as you alluded to, different locations, whether that has an impact on cost of living, on inflation expectations, or expectations of house price increases. We have looked at balance sheets of how they're managing their debt. Of course, these are self-reported. We don't have access to their bank data as of now, but for research purpose, it might be a useful thing to also look at that, how they're managing cost of living in a sort of a slightly higher interest environment. Are they actually investing smartly to try to address, to sort of hedge some impacts of the cost of living? That might be another way of solving that problem of higher cost of living that we see out here. Obviously, because interest rate has been quite high as well of late. Now, so there are other aspects and impact of, say, macroprudential policies on how and why people are using real estate as sort of one of their main investment vehicles rather than going into the stock market, for that matter. That would mean that the volume of trade in the stock market, of course, there are a lot of different instruments that are available as well. Are there more people in Singapore actually who are buying stocks either through the Singapore Exchange or internationally through other channels? Or are they buying more robo-advising services or some other services? How much they're contributing to CPF, whether they're topping it up, because of course, one of the ways that they can also hedge against inflation is to put money into CPF as well, which is giving 2.5% or 4% in the special account. So all of these things are possible ways of looking at how they're managing their finances, would be a good direction to take to kind of, I would say, enhance the data that we have with the information that we have at that particular points of time, because of the quarterly announcement that comes in, the market conditions, whether there's any global events going on. All these things are, research that are ongoing, and we hope to answer some more challenging questions in future too.
A couple of times during this conversation, you have mentioned the term behavioral economics, behavioral finance, and also behavioral bias. Explain for our listeners a little bit about why you need to worry about behavioral bias when you do a consumer survey or inflation expectation survey like this.
Very important point. As I mentioned, if you are a professional forecaster who is a public sector economist or private sector economist, you actually have access to information and you can look at it in a very objective way that these are the information coming in and you have had your experience in the past and you know this has this particular impact. So this is what we expect rationally in some sense, what our forecast of inflation next year would be. But individuals who are mostly focused on their own personal buying, consuming, saving, investment decisions, they don't have that privilege as much because of their day to day life and so on. So they, as we mentioned, might be more adaptive to their own experience, own perception as well. Now, that has some challenges. Now, the main challenge is when you are surveying, you are averaging across a wide cross section of people. Some of them might have much higher, say, so called financial literacy or sophistication, so to say, about understanding data. Others might not have as much. There is quite a few people who say the inflation rate will be 100%. Now, that is very hard to imagine that the prices will double. Unless you have a hyperinflation scenario, I don't think that is very commonplace in most parts of the world. So, given that, we have to find out that whether these factors are influencing in some certain behavioral ways their decision. Current study, in fact, that was presented recently in academic conferences as well, says that whether you're exposed to grocery shopping in a household might have an impact on what you expect inflation expectation would be,
Hmm.
as opposed to someone who is not actively doing grocery shopping, because of course food prices are more volatile and that might be having this impact as well. So we have to adjust for that. So we are giving both versions. So one is what is called a radio button option, giving them certain choices, typically to avoid problem of people picking the center choice, which is called anchoring in a slightly different way. Anchoring bias means that somehow they think that something in the middle would be the right choice because that's what the interviewer intends them to do. That is one bias. There are other bias, as I mentioned, the grocery shopping bias. In some sense, it's basically a frequency bias. People do something more frequently. So it turns out that mostly women does grocery shopping. So they might have certain features that they see more often and they think prices are going up for the basket that they are consuming or they are buying, not consuming per se, they are probably buying for the household. When men, these are US study, actually buys gasoline or petrol more often, and prices, a change of petrol prices have more impact on their perception of inflation. So when we change roles of men doing grocery shopping, the study by Michael Weber and others in Chicago in a Booth School of Business, they actually found out that if you change the roles, exactly the expectation of inflation reverses as well, which means that there are these behavioral biases which can creep in those responses. What we are trying to do is to adjust the behavioral biases with both a free response as well as a radio button response so we can have a better feeling of how these biases are and how to adjust or minimize or mitigate those biases.
Okay, not easy, but I'm glad that you're cognizant of it and you're taking measures to deal with that. This is a very rich data set.
Yep.
12 years worth of data. You've tried various things on the margin as well. What do you plan to do with this data?
So I think the best thing to do for our data to do is to have more researchers working on it. That's sort of how we can get insights into different areas as well. But having said that, we want to see, how this can be used for research purposes to get insights, and particularly to, I would say, in some sense, educate better decision making as well for individuals, and what are the how do you hedge against certain types of risk that we can do, whether people are taking in, for example, a lot of informal debt or informal loans, and that has an impact on this total debt service ratio, which is one of the criteria that is used to try to reduce possible insolvency of borrowers. Those are things that are important policy impact as well. If there are more, it also is an important concern for banks. How do you evaluate risk? What exactly is a credit risk for an individual who has never borrowed before in their life? Are they able to save enough money to pay back, or are they going to get into more and more debt troubles? So these are sort of behavioral questions about how they deal with debt, how they deal with investment, how they deal with consumption. All of these things we can actually look at it carefully and look at their uncertainty and levels of trust they have in the system to also help them understand better how to make better financial decisions, both in terms of consumption as well as investment.
Aurobindo, I have to say, I think SMU in general and SKBI in particular are lucky to have such an energetic and curious researcher like you. So, keep the, work going. We appreciate your insights very much. And thanks for coming to this podcast. This has been great.
Thank you so much for having me. And indeed, all the discussions we have are very helpful in taking this forward as well. So thanks for the support and all the frequent discussions we have. Thanks again.
Look forward to continuing to do that. Thank you to our listeners as well. Kopi Time is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 106 episodes of the podcast are available on YouTube and on all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.